Hello, Leadership Conference participants in virtual land. I'm Susan Murray. I work in OSEP's Monitoring and State Improvement Planning Division as a state lead and also as a fiscal accountability facilitator. And I'm the talking head who's speaking to an empty room but picturing all of you here as we talk about risk assessment today. This session on risk assessment is part of the fiscal strand of the conference, and we invite you to listen to this session as well as the others, to be sure to look at the resources that are linked to the sessions and submit your questions to the discussion board that's part of the overall conference package so that you can really participate fully in this virtual platform. Part of my job here today is to talk about the concept of risk, what it is and what it isn't. I've found over the past months of working on the development of OSEP's risk assessment procedures that it's kind of natural for people to want to even shy away from that word risk. What is lovingly known in the federal government as the Green Book, which is the GAO's book of internal control standards for the federal government, defines risk for us, and they say that it's the possibility that an event will occur and adversely affect the achievement of objectives. So this whole concept of internal controls is addressed in the Green Book that I mentioned for the Education Department and for other federal agencies. And now the Uniform Guidance addresses and elevates the concept of internal controls as an accountability measure for our non-federal entities or those who receive federal grants from us. My colleague, Charlie Nisley, is doing a session in this conference as well on internal controls as a system of accountability. So I encourage you to view that session as well. Internal controls apply equally to federal agencies, so we in OSEP, as the Department of Education, to our grantees, those of you who are representing state education agencies or Part C lead agencies, and in turn to your sub-recipients as well. Risk assessment, the topic of our session, is an internal control process. It's part of the process where we look at what could go wrong and what are the stakes if that thing or other things do go wrong. Risk itself is not inherently bad. It's about events that might or might not happen. And risk assessment is really just a way of identifying and analyzing the vulnerabilities of the entity that you're looking at. And as I mentioned, this discussion of risk assessment is taking place within a strand about fiscal issues. But risk assessment is not just about financial compliance, fiscal compliance. It addresses performance and fiscal compliance as well. I want to take just a minute here to talk about who the requirements for risk assessment apply to. And first I want to talk about the Education Department and OSEP and our requirements regarding risk assessment as it relates to you, our non-federal entities, our grantees, you in most cases being either state education agencies or lead agencies who receive IDEA grants. So it has requirements to utilize internal controls under both the Uniform Guidance and under the GAO's Green Book. And we are actually in OSEP and throughout the federal government, we are monitored quite rigorously for how we implement internal controls. And also every employee of the Department of Education annually undergoes mandatory training related to internal controls. So this is a long-standing part of our work and our processes here. But what has recently happened is that the Uniform Guidance has elevated this whole concept of risk assessment, both for us and for our grantees. So in addition, as a program office, most recently OSEP has been developing our IDEA risk assessment. and risk-based monitoring and technical assistance procedures under the guiding principles of results-driven accountability, RDA. And as I mentioned earlier, this whole concept of risk assessment is not just about financial issues. It addresses performance and fiscal compliance. Thus, OSEP's Part B and Part C organizational assessments are designed to assess risk really for 4 areas. One of those is fiscal issues and fiscal compliance, as well as dispute resolution, results, and compliance. So you, through another session in this virtual leadership conference, have access to more information about OSEP's organizational assessment, our own risk assessment. And I strongly encourage you to view and participate in those sessions, because those processes are going to be integral to how we in OSEP interface with you, our grantees. We just talked a little bit about OSEP's responsibility to assess and mitigate risk related to our grantees or our pass-through entities, SEAs in the case of Part B grants, and lead agencies in the case of Part C grants. In turn, ED's pass-through entities are required to assess the risk of your sub-recipients. So for Part B, those sub-recipients are LEAs because by statutory requirement, they receive sub-awards, and the uniform guidance requirements at 200.331 apply. On the other hand, Part C lead agencies do not make sub-awards as such. However, Part C lead agencies still have responsibility for oversight of the use of Part C funds, making sure that funds are used for the right purposes and meeting requirements under IDEA such as the general supervision requirements and under the uniform guidance such as procurement. Also, even if a lead agency uses a contract, as is often the case, to award Part C financial assistance to some other entity that the department considers a subgrantee, then the risk posed by that receiving entity must be assessed. So the risk assessment process is one tool that Part C lead agencies can also use to fulfill your responsibilities for oversight in ensuring that the statutory and regulatory requirements are met. If you're a Part C lead agency participating in this session, I encourage you to go to the resources section and link to the FAQs that are on the department's uniform guidance portal for grantees. Question number 14 in that document talks about risk assessment requirements for contractors, and I think that's something you want to be familiar with as a Part C lead agency. And actually, to make a plug, everyone should check those FAQs occasionally as they're being updated, and they will be helpful to you in your implementation of the uniform guidance. And just please note on this slide the use of the word must, and again the requirement for risk assessment to address both financial and programmatic considerations. That's important. Just a couple of important notes about the state's requirement to assess risk of subrecipients. One thing is that the uniform guidance does not specify when a risk assessment has to be completed. A state can complete a risk assessment before making a subgrant if it chooses, but it's not required to do it at that time. There are reasons you may want to or need to do that, for example, to identify situations where specific conditions are needed, but it's up to you when to do it. The procedures for assessing risk should be documented and should be included as part of the grantee's written internal controls. And again, those factors to consider are available at the notation on the slide. Again, there's a tendency to think about risk and control environments to be matters of fiscal compliance. And while that's important, and this conversation today is taking place in a sphere of overall fiscal information, there's also a risk that programs will fail to accomplish their programmatic goals. So therefore, risk monitoring must look at successful programmatic implementation in addition to fiscal compliance. And that's why OSEP's organizational assessment that I mentioned earlier has fiscal management as one of the areas of focus in determining risk, but it also includes the 3 other key focus areas that I talked about. And again, I encourage you to view the session that provides more information about OSEP's organizational assessment. The slide we were looking at previously used the word must, but this slide still references that same regulation at 200.331, but it uses the other M word to show some areas that the state may wish to include as part of its risk assessment. The uniform guidance gives you flexibility. It doesn't specify how and when to conduct an assessment or what exactly has to be included. You'll have your own ideas and your own needs about what should be included as you assess risk among your subgrantees. There are lots of considerations to take into account, and some of the things you land on as part of your risk assessment will change from time to time. So, for example, I mentioned that OSEP is going to be including dispute resolution as part of our overall organizational assessment at this point in time, but that will not always be the case. That area of focus will change over time. From your perspective, there might be a state-specific issue that leads you to considering your subgrantee's risk in that specific area. The slide here references your prior experience with that LEA or subrecipient, past audit results, all things that you may want to take into account. It makes a lot of sense. But if there are other things like widespread staff turnovers or economic downturns, or when a major law is reauthorized, or when your state has a major policy change, these things often affect the vulnerability of the entities that are responsible for carrying out that law or those policies, and you may want to have that be part of your risk assessment for a period of time. The uniform guidance suggests the items on this slide that we're looking at now be part of the review, but again, you ultimately decide what to include. Given that IDEA is a formula grant and that then there's a formula for Part B subgrants to subrecipients, we've been asked what is the purpose of a risk assessment on formula grantees and subrecipients if it doesn't affect the receipt or the size of a grant award. First, recipients of formula grants are required to complete risk assessments on each subgrantee. So think back to that first slide with the must word on it and be guided by that, because this activity must occur. And second, I would ask you to think about, are the only risks to you as an SEA or as a lead agency related to the size of an award, or are there other risks, for example, related to programmatic and performance requirements that need to be carried out, or related to the implementation of your state's policies and procedures? Under the uniform guidance, grantees must assess risk to inform monitoring priorities. This risk assessment feeds into a process of internal controls, and this is all part of an overall system, but a very critical part of it. So again, remember to include both programmatic and financial criteria in your risk review. I'm really happy to tell you that during the Fiscal Strand live interactive session, you're going to have a chance to hear from a couple of states, including, I believe, Utah and Kansas, as to how they're approaching IDEA risk assessments with subrecipients or LEAs, and what programmatic and financial criteria they're including in their reviews. So be sure to locate that live interactive session on the schedule and plan to participate, and also to submit your questions via the discussion board. This is a good opportunity for you to learn how some states are using their IDEA risk assessments and how they feed into an overall process of risk management, monitoring, and TA as it relates to subawards. Working in a federal agency in Washington, every morning when we open our paper or click on our news icon, we get a chance to be reminded of the question that's always kind of hovering in the back of our work minds, which is, how would this look if it ended up on the Washington Post? Each of you has your own version of that question. It's just part of the landscape with the kind of work that we do, you do, we all do in administering important federal laws on behalf of children with disabilities and their families. Your risk assessment, while now a required part of the work that you do, is also something in your toolkit to help you maybe not have to read that particular story in your own state or local newspaper, or at least to have another layer of information that you would not have previously had in addressing it.